Picture this. It is November 885. You are standing in the dark on a wooden watchtower above the Seine, and the river has disappeared, not frozen, not flooded, gone, swallowed by a column of longships stretching more than 6 miles upstream. There are so many hulls pressed together that a man could walk from bank to bank without touching water. The prows are high and carved, the shields are painted, and from somewhere inside that black fleet comes a sound unlike anything you have heard before. The low, rhythmic percussion of thousands of men who are not yet fighting but are ready. You have approximately 200 soldiers, you have one island, you have 2 bridges, and the walls of a city that wasn't supposed to matter. It is going to matter. This is not a story about heroic last stands. This is a story about logistics, terrain, and decision-making under pressure, and about how a single year of desperate, grinding urban defense in the middle of France permanently redirected the course of European history. The popular image of this siege is simple. Vikings try to sack Paris, brave defenders repel them, happy ending. That version leaves out almost everything that actually makes this event significant. The defenders did not simply repel the Norse. They survived a year of siege warfare, disease, starvation, engineering, and psychological attrition, while their own emperor, theoretically the most powerful ruler in the Christian West, failed to act. And when that emperor finally arrived, he did not fight, he paid. The fallout from that single decision unraveled a dynasty that had governed Europe for a century. To understand what Paris actually meant in 885, you have to understand what Paris was and what it was not. It was not a great city. It was a small, fortified island in the middle of the river Seine, the Île de la Cité. What made it strategically decisive was its geography. The island sat directly across the only navigable channel deep enough for longships to travel upriver into the interior of West Francia, toward Burgundy, toward Tours, toward everything worth plundering. Paris was a cork in the bottle. If the Viking fleet could not pass the island, it could not reach the wealth beyond it. And it could not pass the island because of 2 low-slung fortified bridges, the Grand Pont to the north, built of stone, and the shorter Petit Pont to the south, built of wood. Even the shallow drafted Viking longships could not clear the bridge spans, control the bridges, control the river. The man who understood this better than anyone was Odo, Count of Paris, known also by his Frankish name Eudes, born around 856 CE. He was the son of Robert the Strong, who had died fighting Vikings in 8666 CE. Odo was, by the time the 885 fleet arrived, an experienced military administrator and a man with something to prove. He was also, critically, a pragmatist. He did not command a great army. He commanded whatever was immediately available. Contemporary accounts, primarily Abbo's eyewitness poem, the Bella Parisiaque Urbis, estimate roughly 200 men-at-arms at the outset. Historians note that Abbo's numbers throughout the poem are frequently exaggerated. But on this point, the figure is corroborated by the Osprey military history of the siege and by general scholarly consensus. 200 is the working number. Alongside Odo stood Bishop Goslin of Paris, described by contemporary and later sources as a fighting bishop, a man who reportedly took his place on the defenses with a bow and an axe alongside his pastoral staff. Goslin understood that the survival of the city was a religious and political necessity, not merely a military one. They had been warned the fleet was coming. Viking forces had been moving up the Seine since the summer of 885, having first struck at Rouen and then at Pont de l'Arche, a fortified bridge roughly 60 kilometers from Paris. At Pont de l'Arche, a Frankish force under Count Raguenold, Margrave of Neustria, attempted to hold the crossing. On July 25, 885, the Vikings broke that position and killed Raguenold in the fighting. The road to Paris was open. Odo used the months that followed to accelerate construction of the bridge towers, specifically the Grand Châtelet on the north bank, which was only partially complete when the fleet arrived. The foundations were solid, the upper levels were still going up. The fleet arrived at Paris on or about November 24 to 25, 885. Contemporary sources, including Abbo and the Annales Vedestini, record their numbers in terms that historians universally regard as inflated. Abbo, an eyewitness monk at the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, describes 700 ships and 40,000 men. The scholarly consensus, citing historians C.W. Previte Orton and John Norris among others, estimates approximately 300 ships. The actual warrior count is unknown and genuinely disputed. Estimates range from a few thousand to the tens of thousands. What is not in dispute is that the force was, by any measure of the period, enormous. A coalition of Norse and Danish warbands, including the contingents of the chieftains Siegfried and Sinric, and possibly Rollo, though Rollo's exact command role here is contested among historians. The principal commander who opened negotiations was Siegfried. According to Abbo's account, he approached the city and requested peaceful passage upriver. He was refused, not by Odo, but by Bishop Goslin. That refusal is the hinge point of the entire episode. Once the passage request was denied, a siege of this scale had its own momentum. The fleet had traveled too far, cost too much in supplies and effort, to simply turn around. On November 26, 885, the day after arrival, the Vikings attacked the northeast tower of the Grand Pont with siege engines, ballistae, catapults, and battering rams. This isn't a mob assault, this is organized mechanical siege warfare. The Franks responded from the tower walls with boiling pitch, hot wax, and wooden shafts tipped with iron points. Every attack that day was repelled. During the night, and this detail matters, Odo's garrison added another story to the top of the tower. They were building while being besieged. On November 27th, the attacks resumed. Mining, fire, more battering rams. Bishop Goslin reportedly fought with his own hands on the walls. The attacks failed again. This isn't a Viking raid, this is a siege. And it immediately revealed a structural problem for the Norse. They were excellent at amphibious assault, hit-and-run tactics, and rapid inland penetration. They were not, at this point in their military development, specialists in sustained siege operations against fortified stone positions. They had brought siege engines, more than most forces of the era. But the two bridge towers, one stone and one wood, held. The siege settled into a grinding winter stalemate. The Vikings established a fortified camp on the right bank of the river, constructing it with stone, a detail recorded in the sources suggesting they intended to stay. They built additional siege equipment. They filled the river shallows near the southern tower with debris, plant matter, animal carcasses, and, according to Abbo and corroborated in the researching Paris records, the bodies of dead prisoners, a documented medieval siege tactic designed to create a causeway or fill a moat. The psychological effect on the defenders watching this process from the walls is not difficult to imagine. Inside the city, conditions were deteriorating. The garrison was holding, but it was not a garrison built for a year-long siege. Food stocks were limited. Movement outside the walls was nearly impossible under continuous Norse observation and raiding of the surrounding countryside. A contemporary source, Regino of Prum, recorded that the Vikings grew so frustrated at one point that they considered abandoning the siege altogether. That they stayed was a function of accumulated investment and, presumably, the promise of the wealth upriver that they still could not reach. In February 886, the situation changed in the Vikings' favor, but not through combat. Heavy winter flooding on the Seine, combined with the accumulated damage from the Norse fire attacks, swept away the wooden Petit Pont to the south. This isolated the small southern bridgehead tower with only 12 defenders inside. The Norse demanded surrender. The 12 refused. They were subsequently killed. This is the only significant structural loss the defenders suffered in the initial months of the siege, and it came from the weather, not from Viking arms. The main island, the Ile de la Cité, remained unbreached. The loss of the Petit Pont was a tactical setback, but also a strategic revelation. The Vikings now controlled the southern channel. Yet they still could not force passage. The Grand Pont and its stone tower remained intact. The garrison, diminished and exhausted, held the north. In an act that speaks directly to his operational thinking, Odo slipped through Norse lines at some point in the spring. The sources disagree on the exact timing, to travel south and appeal personally to Emperor Charles III, known to history as Charles the Fat, for reinforcement. Charles was, technically, the ruler of a unified Carolingian empire stretching from the Rhine to the Loire. He should have responded immediately. He did not. He was in Italy dealing with affairs there. What he sent instead was Heinrich, Count of Saxony, with a contingent of troops. Heinrich marched to Paris in the winter of 818-818-86. His forces, weakened by the march, made one abortive attack against the Viking camp in February, according to war history. Org's account, drawing on primary sources, Heinrich rode his horse into a 3-foot-deep stake-lined trench excavated around the Norse perimeter and was captured and killed. The relief force evaporated. Inside the city, disease arrived in the spring. The sources record plague spreading through the Parisian garrison in April and May of 886. On April 16, 886, Bishop Goslin died of the sickness. He had fought through the entire winter campaign, and the epidemic took him without a blade. Around the same time, Siegfried, the principal Viking commander, apparently calculated that the siege was no longer worth prosecuting. He negotiated a personal payment of 60 pounds of silver from the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés and withdrew his contingent from the siege. This is not a Frankish victory. This is Siegfried cutting his losses. Another commander, Rollo, stayed with the remaining forces and continued the blockade. Odo, meanwhile, was moving. He broke through Viking lines a second time and made his way to Charles the Fat with the full weight of what the city had endured. Charles assembled his army and marched. He arrived at Paris in October 886 with a force large enough to encircle the remaining Norse camp. For a moment, the arithmetic was clear. The Franks had the numbers, the position, and the moral authority of a population that had fought for nearly a year. A battle would have been decisive. Charles did not fight, he negotiated. He paid the remaining Viking forces 700 pounds of silver. He permitted them to sail further upriver into Burgundy, conveniently, a region then in open revolt against Carolingian rule, so the Vikings served as a punitive tool, and he sent them away. The Parisians, who had survived the 11-month siege, responded with fury. When the Viking fleet attempted to return home via the Seine, passing back through Paris, the city refused to let them through the river. The Norse were forced to portage their longships overland through the grounds of Saint-Germain-des-Prés and across approximately 3 kilometers of terrain to reach the Marne River and access the North Sea. It is a small but telling act. A city with no emperor willing to fight for it, refusing to extend even the courtesy of passage to the men they had bled to keep out. The political fallout was severe and swift. Charles the Fat's willingness to pay the tribute after a year of Parisian sacrifice shattered what remained of his authority in the West. As rebellions multiplied and noble support collapsed, Charles was deposed in late 887 CE. He died in January 888, 6 weeks after accepting deposition. The Carolingian line that had governed Western Europe since Charlemagne, the empire built on military supremacy and the prestige of the Frankish church, had effectively ended. In February 888, the Frankish nobility elected Odo, Count of Paris, as King of West Francia. He was the first non-Carolingian monarch of the Western Kingdom. The man who had held 2 bridges with 200 soldiers became the king precisely because the emperor with the armies had not. Paris itself was transformed by what had happened to it. It had been, under the Carolingians, a relatively minor administrative node, not a capital, not a seat of empire. After 885 to 886, its strategic importance was undeniable and its political prestige was earned in blood. Its centrality to the emerging French kingdom was no longer theoretical. The siege had proved the argument. The longer consequence arrived in 911, when Charles the Simple, the Carolingian successor who eventually displaced Odo's line, reached a treaty with the Viking leader Rollo. Rollo received a large land grant centered on Rouen, in exchange for conversion to Christianity and a pledge to defend the Frankish coast. That territory became Normandy. The descendants of the men who had stood outside Paris in 885 demanding passage would one day rule England. The siege of Paris was not the end of the Viking Age in France. It was one of the negotiations that produced everything that came after. The moral weight of this episode is not simple to settle. Odo was genuinely heroic. Tactically sharp, physically courageous, and loyal to a city that its own emperor abandoned. But he was also a man whose political career was built on that abandonment. The suffering of civilians inside Paris, the plague, the hunger, the psychological weight of watching their countryside burned from the walls, served his eventual elevation as much as it tested him. Charles the Fat is remembered as a coward, but his decision to pay tribute, rather than risk a pitched battle against a hardened army of Norse veterans was not obviously irrational. Pitched medieval battles were catastrophically unpredictable. He had already sent one commander to his death in a ditch, 200 men holding 11 months against a fleet that consumed the river. An emperor who paid the bill, a city that refused, even at the end, to give an inch it hadn't already lost. What does it mean to survive a siege your own king wouldn't fight? What does it mean when the act of not surrendering is, itself, the political revolution?